as individuals, probably as communities, we have an optimism bias. We want to think of the positive things. It's very difficult for us to deal with negative things, especially amorphous threats like a virus. Like if we are dealing with climate change is another example of that, right? So I think there's a bias for us not to want to deal with that because we could be absorbed by all negative feeling. We've shifted our teaching here at the university and most universities to be online, and I've got some students that are perfectly fine finishing their terms, and others that are just so anxious and so nervous about being away from their families that they're not able to do it. So I think it's the full gamut of human emotion that takes place.
How's it, guys? So today I'm thrilled and privileged to bring you the story and research of an incredible historian. His name is James Daschuk. He's the author of the book Clearing the Plains: Disease, Politics of Starvation, and the Loss of Aboriginal Life. This is a harrowing account of the systemic practices of starvation that were implemented by Canada's first Prime Minister against the Indigenous people, really to clear the way for settlement. And the multiple award-winning Clearing the Plains sparked widespread debate about genocide in Canada, because, you know, when you think about Canada, you don't think about things like genocide. But certainly James has shone a light for Canadians and more broadly the audience of the international community around the systems that have been put in place to separate us as human beings. And even to this day, the present disparity in health and economic well-being between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, both locally in South Africa and again in Canada, and all around the world, the lingering racism and misunderstanding that permeates the national consciousness and consciousness of the general population around the world. But this really is a story about history. It's a story about reconciling our own unique histories to create a future that we can aspire to. So without further ado, into James Daschuk. And we're live. Hey guys, welcome back to yet another cracking installment of the Map Round Show. Today I'm joined all the way from some place I can't pronounce in Canada. But James Daschuk, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Nice to be here.
Where are you?
I'm in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. It's great to have Americans try to pronounce the name of my town.
Yeah, I'm sure. Or South Africans for that matter, right? So James, you're highly regarded in your field. So for our viewers and listeners out there, what do you do exactly? What's your kind of claim to fame?
I have a PhD in Canadian history, and I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies here at the University of Regina. So my joke is I'm one of the better historians in the phys ed department at U of R. So I spent a couple of decades researching the roots of the health disparity between, I guess, settler Canadians, mainstream Canadians, and the Indigenous population here in Western Canada.
Okay, and now why would you do something like that? Where did this journey start?
That's a good question. One of the things I noticed maybe 30 years ago when I was back in grad school was just how different people's lives were. Neighbors, in fact. There's a Canadian federal government minister a couple years ago said that there was a 15-year difference in life expectancy between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in Canada. So we should have access to the same services. We claim to be, a fair and decent country, but really that hasn't been the case, really since Confederation in the mid 1800s.
It's funny this exact thing has come up. I was talking to her name's I've gone blank, but she'll be coming up on my show soon. But essentially, she's also an historian, but she focused really on pandemics and based in the US. And we were reviewing a New York Times article that's actually on my Twitter. I'm happy to get it up if you like. But one of the things that came through in terms of their research, which was a 40-year review of the economic development of the different classes of the American population, and how the system has created an unequal distribution of wealth across many different populations. And it seems to me like we have that here in South Africa, and you're describing a similar situation over there. I mean, if you look at it in a historical context, like what is driving this? I mean, life expectancy was, by the way, one of the things that came out of this New York Times piece of research, where if you're in the top 1% of earners, you will live up to 15 years longer.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a phenomenon, I guess the wider phenomenon, and I would discuss this with my students, the social determinants of health. And one of the things I think that surprises my students is that 80% of the arc of our lives, the health arc of our life from birth, which is probably a pretty dangerous time, to the end of our life, isn't shaped by medical intervention. It's shaped by social and economic forces, social economic status, where we live, what kind of food we have access to. And we are seeing, I don't know, the mother of all lessons in that right now with the pandemic. In the States, I've been trying not to pay too much attention to American media, but African Americans are greatly overrepresented with people who are sick and people who've died. And here in Canada, I'm not sure what things are like in South Africa, but here in Canada, our major loci of death, of mortality, are senior citizens' home, because they're vulnerable, they're immune suppressed, they're often living in very crowded conditions. And so we've got places where literally dozens of people have died in a very short order.
Sorry, my 2-year-old daughter, do you want to come say hello? Come here. Reagan, come here.
Oh, hi Reagan, how's it going?
Check you out. He's that.
Hi.
Are you going to take over the Matt Brown show and call it the Reggie Bear show? Eh? Just make sure you ask great questions. Okay.
My youngest has her driver's license, so I just got to worry about car accidents.
Oh, jeez. It just gets worse, right?
Your time will come, yeah.
The things you have to worry about, right? Well, yeah. So, I mean, what are some of the key findings through your research when it comes to the systems that drive this unequal, distribution of wealth, the system that drives, longevity and lifespan across different populations, indigenous or not? What have you observed there?
Well, from the starting point of this very wide disparity, and I'm sure it's the same thing in South Africa between Black South Africans and I guess newcomer South Africans, that gap, I went back into time, and I've got a degree in archaeology, so I was able to read the archaeological literature. And what I found was before Europeans showed up on the continent of North America, it wasn't, I wouldn't say indigenous people lived in a disease-free paradise. There were diseases, but the onslaught of new diseases brought by Europeans when they arrived in America was literally, one American scholar, David Stannard, called it a Holocaust. Think of this, okay? The coronavirus is a virgin soil epidemic among us all. None of us has an acquired immunity because it's a new virus, right? Mm-hmm. In the case of smallpox here in North America, or I guess in the Americas, none of the indigenous people had any pre-existing resistance to smallpox. And we're just lucky that the coronavirus is nowhere near as dangerous as the smallpox virus. So what that means is that in the span of 3 weeks or a month, you could have as many as 8 out of 10 people dying a terrible death. Like, that's the level of mortality. And the bigger, the more sophisticated the society, the greater the mortality because of population density and a bunch of other factors. And in addition to that, we had our indigenous societies here work through oral knowledge, oral testimony, oral history. So in the span of 3 weeks, you lose your elders who contain they're sort of like your library of your community. You lose potentially 80% of your hunters, children, moms, you name it. So those societies were never the same again. And as I tell my students, the somewhat fortunate few who survived that have just lived through the most deadly disease episode, the most deadly disease in human history. Many of them died of hunger because they couldn't move to get food. So those outbreaks, those virgin soil outbreaks, were like an apocalypse for some communities.
Yeah. How much of this was actually state supported?
In the early days, I don't think it was. This is before, the germ theory of disease and that kind of thing. I'm sure the Christians who came, just thought it was fate. In fact, the Pilgrim Fathers who set up, some of the first colonies in the United States thought it was providence that so many indigenous people had died, and that there were basically gardens that had been abandoned through mortality were there for the newcomers. So, they, in their minds, it was almost divine intervention.
Yeah. It seems to me that a lot of this history has been deliberately suppressed. I mean, if you think about the Americans and I say the Americans then, but the first, colonialists that arrived in America, and, you had your indigenous populations there, they were literally wiped out through force and other means. And, I think there's some conversation about it, but not... For at least, I'm not living in America, but from what I can observe, is that a lot of the history around the impact of diseases, state-supported starvation, and things like that on these indigenous populations has largely been suppressed, and deliberately, one could argue. I mean, would you agree with a statement like that?
About this, the suppression. That's a very interesting question, because I'm working on this, and I'm working on researching a smallpox epidemic that happened in the 1860s. Just in the aftermath of the California gold rush. Okay, they discovered gold in California in 1848, 1849, and there was a huge influx of settlers. And I'm just staring over at my bookcase, and there are actually books called An American Genocide State. So it's interesting that it's been, rather than suppressed, it's been ignored. So scholars are writing about this, and I've got colleagues in the States that will, like, these are cases of undeniable genocide. The early government of California raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for quote unquote Indian hunting militias. Like, it was undeniably genocidal. But what it is Americans will just say, yes, it was a genocide, and move on. We in Canada, and we are very judgmental in Canada of our southern neighbors, we've taken, I guess, a lesson from your playbook in South Africa. And in the last few years, we've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission travel around the country to talk about residential schools, which is one of our sort of ugliest chapters in our history. So for probably 80 years or even more, young Indigenous kids were taken away, sent to mission schools, weren't allowed to speak their languages, were treated very poorly, many cases of sexual abuse, psychological abuse, that kind of thing. Institutionalized malnutrition to the point where I've got a colleague, Ian Mosby, has written about Canadian government nutritional experiments on residential school children. This is in the mid 20th century. People were working on developing nutrition science. So these physicians who were working for the Canadian government would go to residential schools, probably ask if they could feed the children more food. There was no money to feed the children because it was such a low priority. And then they would ask if they could, give half of the students riboflavin or something like that, or a vitamin supplement. But in order to get a scientific baseline for those studies, they just kept all the kids malnourished for a year or two to establish that baseline. So we're trying to come to terms with that in Canada. Like I said, we've had years of discussion. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, a few years ago said that this was one of his top priorities. He's frustrated a lot of people because it's very hard to turn that ship around. It's been going one way for 150 years. He's not going to be able to do it overnight.
Yeah, so this is the similar conversation to what I was having with Nancy Bristow. That's the lady I was referring to earlier. If you think about even the COVID-19 situation that we kind of suddenly find ourselves in, one of the key points that she made to me yesterday was that, history in the pandemic sense has also been largely ignored. There was the 1918 Spanish flu, and that decimated killed 50 million people in like 6 weeks or something insane like that. Yeah. Then COVID came around and we were like, I'm sorry, what's this? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, they were large, even though it was documented, even though what your research has clearly shown, that it has been documented to an extent, but it has largely been ignored. Do you feel a sense at all that society has allowed these kinds of things to happen? So whether that's the prejudice treatment towards Indigenous populations of Canada, and more broadly, then you think about the pandemic that we currently find ourselves in around the world. Do you think society has just kind of allowed this to happen, and if so, why?
I think as individuals, probably as communities, we have an optimism bias. We want to think of the positive things. It's very difficult for us to deal with negative things, especially amorphous threats like a virus. Like if we are dealing, climate change is another example of that, right? So I think there's a bias for us not to want to deal with that because we could be absorbed by all negative feeling. We've shifted our teaching here at the university, and most universities, to be online. And I've got some students that are perfectly fine finishing their terms, and others that are just so anxious and so nervous about being away from their families that they're not able to do it. So I think it's the full gamut of human emotion that takes place. One thing here in Canada in the aftermath of the 1918 flu was we set up a federal and national level Department of Health. So I guess there were institutional changes after that terrible pandemic. One interesting thing, and I guess this ties into the gap between Indigenous people and the rest of us in Canada, was that Indigenous people weren't the responsibility of the federal government or of the Department of Health. They stayed under the mandate of the Department of Indian Affairs. So by the 1930s, 15 years after the pandemic, a sick Indigenous person was the responsibility of the Canadian Minister of Mines. So it's a crazy situation. It's very reminiscent of your history in South Africa.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I would say most people, when they think about Canada, or let me not talk for the rest of the world. When I think of Canada, I think of justice and fairness and a very candy coated view of, well, Canada's amazing. Like I've been there. I've been to Vancouver and Toronto. It's an amazing place. I could highly see myself living in Vancouver. You know what I mean? And I like Canadians. And as you say, there's a lot of. I would also argue that there's world judgment from the rest of the world outside of Canada towards your southern neighbors as well. You understand? So Canada's always a step above America. Like America's the one. What I mean by step above, well, it's your lifestyle. It's very much about togetherness, and Justin Trudeau is a fantastic leader, and like some other people we might mention, I've got my green card for the States. That's why I'm not trying to diss. I don't know if the FBI is going to be listening to this.
Just in case.
You know what I mean? You never know. Yeah. iTunes isn't America. Anyway, so when I think about Canada, I think about all the good things about human culture and history, and how and the work of good, solid Canadians that, over time have created a great country brand. Do you think what you're basically describing to me is actually something else? You're saying to me that there's a candy-coated version of Canadian history in some sense, and that, as you say, this is like Canada's Holocaust, right? That isn't really discussed and documented, etc. I mean, what do we need to know about that Canada's Holocaust, quote unquote? I mean, to what extent is it similar to other Holocausts that we know about, probably more so than anything else around the world? In what ways is it similar? To what extent was this such a big deal and an unsettling, unsparing, and kind of gut-wrenching, exercise by the states? For
sure. Well, one thing is, that Holocaust analogy I used was for the virgin soil epidemic. So in my part of the country, I'm in the middle of the northern Great Plains, halfway between the boreal forest and the Rocky Mountains, literally in the middle of the grasslands. Our virgin soil epidemic here in this territory took place in the 1780s, and it really was like a Holocaust. The indigenous nations, some indigenous identities completely disappeared. In fact, the dominant indigenous group here in my territory are called the Plains Cree. Well, the Plains Cree, there were fur traders around. The Hudson's Bay Company was a presence. They were keeping journals and had communities identified. Some First Nations, our tribes are called First Nations. Some of those nations disappeared as distinct entities, and in the aftermath, when the dust settled from those epidemics, new identities were formed. And the Plains Cree survivors came together, brought their traditions, and recreated family structures and that kind of thing to establish this new identity of the Plains Cree. So those early epidemics, you could use the analogy of a Holocaust. I would say that's probably pushing it for federal government policy, but we've got a very, your description as a sugar-coated identity is probably a good one. What I would say is that from the time Canada acquired this territory, and as it expanded, there were treaties. So there was an acknowledgement that First Nations people, that the Indigenous people own the land, and so those treaties were ostensibly about surrendering title to the land. Now, there's new scholarship. Indigenous scholars have talked about this for years, that the discussion of surrendering ownership of the land wasn't discussed at the negotiation. It was put into the legal terminology of the printed text back in Ottawa and sent back. So the Indigenous people didn't actually understand that they weren't told that they were transferring the land. When they transferred, when these treaties were completed, very soon after, the Indigenous people were forced to live on very small plots of land. Their movement eventually, within less than a decade of signing the treaties, their movement was controlled with a pass system. And I know you folks had a pass system in your country. Our country used a pass system to keep Indigenous people out of the commercial economy. So for a First Nations person, for an Indian person to leave the reserve, you needed a written pass from a white Indian agent, probably from 1885 into the 1950s. So sure. Mobility was controlled. We talked about residential schools. From the 1880s on, just about every single Indigenous child was taken from their families purposely to break the bonds of family and community and tradition, and was retrained in a Christian environment where, like I said, you had institutionalized malnutrition, you had cases of sexual abuse, psychological abuse. It must have been a living hell. And I remember a couple of years ago, I was at a First Nation, and somebody said, imagine this, imagine a community with no children. That's what our communities were like. So you've got generation upon generation. That residential school system worked for probably 100 years. You had children being taken away from their parents. They lived through probably, a living hell at the residential schools. When they were allowed to go back and had their own children, their children were taken away. So you had the double horror of not only the children going through that terrible ordeal in most cases, you had the parents knowing they were going to go through that ordeal. At the residential schools, this is crazy. This is like a seemingly unimportant thing, but very soon after the schools were established, there was a change in the funding regime. And what that meant was that rather than every school getting a grant from the government, it was religious denominations, Catholics and Protestants, that provided the service. Rather than a grant being given to the schools, there was a grant per child. So what that meant was it wasn't enough money per child. So the schools ended up cramming as many children as they could just to make ends meet, kind of an economy of scale. So for generations, those schools were overpopulated, the children were malnourished, and they became breeding grounds for tuberculosis. And that's an institutionalized program that really wasn't dealt with. So the schools, as part of their architecture, actually had cemeteries designed into their construction projects because the mortality was so high.
Holy shit.
Another aspect of this was there was something called an Indian Act that was imposed in 1876, which turned adult male First Nations people, and we didn't have universal suffrage, only men got the vote. But from 1876 to 1960, the legal status of an adult First Nations person was that of a child. They were basically wards of the state. So they There was no participation in governance outside of the community. Basically, the state controlled identity, controlled every aspect of people's lives from birth to death. And we are probably the only liberal democracy that still has a racially based law, the Indian Act. And there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years about what to do with it, because this crazy act, which is like totally based in race, like it determines who an Indian is, and like I said, it's old school terminology because it was developed in 1876, is the only legislation, while it's been used to subjugate and marginalize people, it's the only piece of law we have in Canada that acknowledges the differential status of First Nations people, which also provides them with Indigenous rights. So it's it's a tough one. People have been arguing about this for years. Like, what do you do with it? Because you can't just end it, because Indigenous people have treaty rights, they've got land rights, they've got communal rights that have to be recognized. So, like I said, it wasn't the militaristic kind of attack that the Americans undertook. Like they actually had Indian wars. We didn't have that same level of violence, but we certainly had institutionalized violence that was maintained, for 100 years or more.
That is frightening for me. That's really hectic. Just to hear it, because it just makes you question everything that you know. Because it makes me realize that you only know what you don't know, or you don't know what you don't know, actually. You know what I mean? And it's just like, whoa. But I mean, it's fascinating, this whole thing for me, because what drives something like this? Like if I think about apartheid as a system, I mean, obviously it was horrific and should never have happened, and like, I can't speak for Hendrik Verwoerd, I mean, I've had one conversation around where it came from, and it was literally around a system to divide the population and to enforce economic differences and differences within society and class, but by design. It's a deliberate way to like, as an example, there's a township near every mine, because you're going to work at the mine, so you will only ever get paid a certain amount of money. And so who drives those, who buys from that community, right? Well, the ladies selling and making clothing and things like that. Well, it's the rich white, privileged people in the suburbs. And that's how it's been. And by the way, it still is today. It's obviously we're living in a democracy now, but still you can see the impact of the system. We've got the Apartheid Museum here, and, at least, thank God we have our history being shown in its full glory, and I use glory in a very loose sense there, because it wasn't exactly glorious for us, but it's worth remembering, and so if you think about apartheid and you think about what you've just described, where you've got, kids being taken away from these Indigenous families, I mean, to break the bond of family in these kind of communities, it's like, I cannot reconcile in my mind why we would do this. And that's kind of my question to you. What drives this in your experience? What has your research led you to conclude?
Well, the simple reason is racism. But I guess the way to think about this is a lot of these institutions, probably in South Africa as well, the mindset that established these social relations was, sort of a Victorian English accent mindset. So here's an example in Canada. Okay, so in my part of the country, the Indigenous people lived for thousands upon thousands of years, and the bedrock of their food supply was the bison. You've seen a buffalo, right? Like those cowboy movies. Okay, so with that technology and with that nutrition base, Indigenous people on the Great Plains in the 19th century were the tallest people in the world, right? Very high protein, low fat diet, and as much as you wanted. Within, maybe 10 years of signing treaties, the bison disappeared. There was a famine, and the Indigenous people had the foresight to have a famine and pestilence clause built into some of the treaties. And it was like, in a time of crisis, the government will come through with humanitarian aid. I'm using modern terminology, but that was the thing. But what happened was that rather than humanitarian aid being provided, that stipulation in the treaty forced people into treaties and forced them onto those reserves I was talking about, very small pieces of land where they were ostensibly to take up agriculture, but there were so many institutional barriers that agriculture really didn't work because basically a white official was jerking them around on a regular basis. There are a few communities, a few indigenous communities, the Dakota people who weren't considered to be indigenous to Canada. Some you may have heard of a famous chief called Sitting Bull who dispatched the General Custer in the 7th Cavalry. Sitting Bull actually spent some time in Canada. The American cavalry was chasing him, and he produced at the border. There were a couple of Northwest Mounted Police, the Mounties. The Mounties met him, and he produced a George III medal, and he said, "I'm a British subject," because Sitting Bull's ancestors had fought for England in the War of 1812. So he and 5,000 followers were allowed into Canada, and there are a few Dakota communities that were given reserves because they weren't treaty Indians, like they didn't have the legal status of treaty. They had a very different medical history and economic history. So in your country, the indigenous people were used, as you said, by the rich white entrepreneurs. Their labor, their human resources were used for the benefit of white people. In Canada, the pass system I mentioned earlier, which was only imposed on treaty Indians, was used to keep them out of the commercial economy. So if there was a true aspiration for assimilation to get everyone together, they went exactly the opposite way and kept people out of the economic system. I was telling you about the farms not really working out on reserves. In, I think it was 1888, somebody in Ottawa read about the ladder of civilization. So this is like social Darwinism. It's complete hokum, like it's baloney, but it's the hierarchy of social organization from, barbarism through whatever it is. And the pinnacle would be, say, Victorian England. Okay. Are you familiar with that kind of concept, Matt?
Yeah.
Okay. So somebody realized that commercial farming wasn't working out on reserves out here in the West. And what they did was, for 15 years, they imposed something called the peasant farming policy. And what that was they took away mechanical farming implements and gave the people hand scythes, like the Grim Reaper would use at a Halloween party. And what that was to get people to go through the stage of social organization called the peasant stage in order to, like they were jumping too many stages of civilization. And I think that's the kind of thinking that ran most of these institutions. Like there was just an assumption by, Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Celts from England who were, dominating the world with the British Empire, that they were destined to run the world, right? And so once those institutions got set up, they just kept rolling. And like I said, in the case of Canada, the last residential school didn't close until 1996. It's crazy.
Yes, that's insane. Well, they used to say that the sun would never set on the British, or doesn't set on the British Empire, would never not set on the British Empire, something like that. The sun would always shine on it. And yet today they're no longer part of the European Union. So,
Yeah, things change. So one thing, this is outside of my specialty, but I've got colleagues that have been working on the relationship between Canadian government officials and South African government officials in the early 20th century. So there I don't know about teams of South African officials coming to look at the reserve system, but there was exchange of ideas between our government and your government in the early 20th century. So a lot of
really,
like the ideas were shared.
See, that's fascinating for me. That's like genuinely fascinating for me. Can you elaborate on that, and what have you heard or discovered in that area?
Well, like I said, this is outside of my personal research.
Sure.
But there were South African officials came to Canada and looked at our system of reserves, which is basically it's an apartheid system. Like people were compelled to live on there through the pass system, and actually that pass system had no legal authority. It was government policy. Like if an Indigenous person had been able to go to court, I'm sure that it would have been a house of cards. But for a couple of decades in the 20th century, it was illegal in Canada for a First Nations person to hire a lawyer. Talk about a stacked deck, eh?
Jesus.
So South African officials came and maybe got ideas from our system. And I think it was from the 19-teens up until probably the early 1950s. We had some changes to the Indian Act. There were some amendments that made it less draconian, I guess, if you want to think about it that way. And I think that's where our two systems really diverged, because I think in South Africa, and I'm no expert at all, but in South Africa, the rules got more strict in the 1950s. Ours were liberalized to some extent, and there were changes in policy, where in your country things got harsher and more forceful.
Yeah.
But for a generation or two, they were probably on pretty parallel courses.
Yeah, that's interesting for me. I've had a couple of conversations on the show about governments doing social experiments, quote unquote. One of those conversations was with a chap who's far out there. His name's Bill Yarborough. He was part of the MK Ultra mind control experimentation story, where they took literally same thing, took kids away from families and like did all sorts of weird things trying to develop an interrogation protocol that would rival the Soviets during the Cold War. And there's quite a few different stories. There were these twins. I don't know. There's a program on Netflix with, I don't know whether you've seen it, whether you have Netflix out there, but you have it. Yeah, cool. So there are these.
You have Canadian Netflix.
Oh, you have Canadian Netflix. Does that count though? Because South African Netflix doesn't count. Half the stuff you can't get.
That's the joke here. Somebody's got an American Netflix account, and they're like they're like the drug dealer. Yeah.
So it's like there were these twins that it was a famous story in America even to this day, and it's covered in this Netflix documentary where these twins were also separated at birth. And one was put into a lower class family, a middle class family, the second one, and then the third in an affluent family. And they monitored them for 20 years. And just by chance, they reconnected. And then the whole story gets into, well, what was this program actually, you know? And it was literally this social experiment carried out and funded by the US government. Right. Wow. Yeah. And so then you got MK Ultra, and it's like at different stages of history. And so actually, if you go all the way back to where your story starts, it seems to me that, you know, we've been playing social experiments for hundreds of years. It's obviously the motivations behind these different things. Some can be positive and some are largely negative. But if you think about even looking forward to the present day, if you think about social experiments in the digital age, it's like, well, you've got fake news, right? The ability to manipulate elections through data, you know, you know, do you feel like, you know, there's value in social experimentation, and how should we be experimenting with current society?
Wow, that's a good question. Talking about the social experimentation, I told you about that peasant farming system, and that was absolutely based on pseudoscience, right? This social Darwinist concept. But as we went through generation upon generation of children being taken away, I told you about the Indian Act being, liberalized. Like the crazier parts were changed in the 1950s. Over the course of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, many of those schools were shut down, and they had something called day schools. Okay, so like rather than the kids being taken away from their families, there were federal government schools in the communities. But almost as soon as the residential school system was winding down, there was a new issue that was brought up, and what that was foster care. So this is another issue that's coming to the fore here in Canada. There are more Indigenous children in foster care mostly with non-Indigenous families, vast majority with non-Indigenous families. There are more Indigenous kids in foster care right now than were ever in the residential school system. So what that is children were taken, adopted, as you said, into different kinds of families, and never, they were taken away because they were poor. Their families may have loved them, but social workers, and I'm sure they were white social workers, took the kids, apprehended the kids, and had them adopted out. So we've got literally hundreds of thousands of people who are looking for their biological families here in Canada. Jeez. So that's another version of, we call it social experimentation. I'm sure the social workers did it, were motivated in their own minds by doing good, but it didn't really pan out that way.
Yeah, and also the just to go back to that series, it's called 3 Identical Strangers. Have a look. Yeah, have a look for that. But and I'm kind of, spoiler alert, so don't close your ears if if you want to watch this thing. But basically, right at the end, a lot of documents, 20,000 documents were classified, and then through this actual movie, they were declassified, but they were largely redacted. And unfortunately for these twins, and by the way, there were other examples of other twins. So to this day, we still don't know actually how many twins were separated at birth. But the sad part was there was no conclusion to it. It was like it was just done, but there was no conclusion. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Which is an incredibly sad thing, because we can point fingers and go, oh, well, look at this, and look at, these families, and look at this, and look at this. But what's the conclusion for it? Do you know what I mean? We look at it with a heavy heart, and we go, oh, this is ridiculous. They can't believe that we allowed this to happen, and racism, blah, 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 blah. But there's not really a conclusion. Do you know what I mean? To many of these, some of there are, of course, but in many respects there aren't. I mean, what conclusion do you land on when it comes to social experiments and the systems that drive inequality?
Yeah, that sort of points to, we've got a lot of talk in the last 5 years or so about reconciliation, and basically what you're talking with that is supposed to mean it's been cheapened because people are using it all the time, but it's coming to a conclusion, right? Figuring it out. And there's an Indigenous scholar from Ontario, Pam Palmater, who gave a talk at the university, and one of the things is that a lot of non-Indigenous people are like, can't you guys get over it? All like residential schools have been closed, like we're trying to get out, can't you get over it? And what Pam Palmater said was, well, we can get over it. We could get over it if it wasn't still happening to us. And one of the examples she used, I've been talking about schools and then fosterage and all that stuff. One of the crazy things that continues even into the present is that on reserve, so there it's land, the land is owned by the federal government for use and in trust for the communities that live there. The Indigenous people don't own the land. If a school is on the reserve, and some communities are quite big, several thousand in some cases, but some are just a few hundred. If the school is on reserve, it's funded by the federal government, by the government of Canada. If the school is off reserve, it's a provincial authority. I live in the province of Saskatchewan, so Saskatchewan would pay for schools that are off reserve. And one of the things I tell my students is the provincial funding system provides probably 11,000 Canadian dollars per child or per student in the schools. In the federal government system, it's more like $7,000. So think of this, Matt. From the time an Indigenous kid on a reserve goes to kindergarten, like 5 years old, they're at a 30% funding deficit from other kids who are just off reserve in a provincial system. So that's institutionalized racism. And the Trudeau government, they've been in power for 5 or 6 years. They're trying to address this, but the funding differences are so huge. It's going to take decades to fix it, to close that gap. Yeah. And education is an extremely important social determinant of health. And a few years ago, somebody did a study. It was actually during a federal election. And an Indigenous leader said in Canada, it was more likely for a First Nations teenager to be incarcerated than to graduate from high school. Think of that one.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And again, it's hard, like once you know something, it's hard to unknow it, right? As you said. But a lot of Canadians, like I said, a lot of Canadians are really, it challenges our identity, like who we think we are. For 95% of us, if you could be oblivious to the Indigenous issues, we're fine, but we're not.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm a big subscriber to is the idea that identity is one of the most powerful forces in the world. And so to your point around reconciliation, I mean, we you mentioned it earlier, we did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But, I should say, and it's necessary to reconcile your history in order to form a more accurate identity for you, and then your own history from where you come from, South Africa in my case, Canada in your case, and then to find the perspective and the perspective that you need to make new choices. Do you know what I mean? Because apartheid, in my schooling wasn't taught. Do you know what I mean? Like at all.
Right.
I remember watching Nelson Mandela be released from prison on TV, and I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know what country I really lived in at all. So I was ignorant, and I was deliberately protected from the truth. I remember saying to my dad, I was like, "Who is that?" And he goes, "No, that's Nelson Mandela." And I was like, "Well, who's that?" And he goes, "No, he's going to be the future president." But it's like, but you don't know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I got another great story. There's a lady I had on the show, and she wrote a book all about forgiveness. And her dad was murdered by Eugene de Blanche. He was assassinated, and Eugene was part of the organization that was the right wing white militant organization that was very much trying to.
Him on the news here in Canada.
Oh, really?
Didn't he have like an arm patch like a Nazi?
That's it. Yeah, it was a red one, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and also as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, she met him face to face with the family. And they went to the prison and so on and so forth. And she forgave him because she had to reconcile, but she had to reconcile her history as part of that. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
But I don't think a lot of people choose not to reconcile their history. And why do you think that is?
I just think it's too tough to, like if your identity is based on a fraud or a crime or something like that, it's pretty tough. If you've been living a good middle-class life, as both of us probably did, it's very tough for us to, my life is built on a scam. I remember somebody used the analogy, what if you invited someone into your house and then they took over your house and then they locked you in the basement of your house? You know what I mean? It's tough for us who are, it's the structure. We might think we're kind people and we're kind to our families and other people in our sort of demographic group, but it's easy for us to ignore. But another thing is, in that situation where the victim's relative talked to Mr. Terre Blanche, like there was that personal connection, and from what I understand, you could swear at the person, you killed my relative or whatever it is. But in the aftermath of that, we still don't have a great, and this is in Canada, probably the same in South Africa, we don't have a shift in the wealth. So those social determinants I talked to you about at the beginning of our talk, Indigenous people are still largely poor. And like I said, through inequity in the education system, there's food insecurity. And there's probably very similar situation to that in South Africa, right? Like, so you're ostensibly legally free, but you're still bound by the shackles of poverty or whatever it might be. Like those are the structural changes. And I don't know, man, that's totally going to be a generational project.
Yeah, it is. And I think the lady's name is Candice Mummer, and the actual book's called Forgiveness Redefined. We have the same publisher, and but to say whose role is it now? And I think Candice is a young woman, right? She's in her 20s, 26 or something like that. And so when I look at what she's done with reconciling her past and creating, becoming to terms with her own story, packaging it so that it can make a difference to others, to raise awareness of the true history, right? And its unique impact on specific people. And then by sharing that narrative, it ultimately makes the difference that, as you say, is necessary in the future.
Yeah. And one of my things, I guess, is because I'm a professor, because I'm a teacher, the change is going to come with the young people. So one thing that our province has done, and we've got Saskatchewan is it's not necessarily an outlier, but we have probably 18% First Nations and Métis. So the Métis would be kind of like the analogy of your colored people back in the old days. Okay.
Yep.
So we've got an ever-growing Indigenous population here in Saskatchewan. So one of the things that the provincial government, who's in charge of education, is they've mandated Indigenous education to every student in the province, and that's been going for probably 10 years or more. So you were talking about you never learned the history of apartheid in school. A lot of people my age never heard about like whether it was suppressed or just ignored. We can talk about that one. But like my students get to hear about this, and we've just shifted over with the pandemic. We've just shifted over to online teaching and stuff like that. And one of the things I asked my students to do was to watch and comment on a documentary film. So get this, we've got a marginalized population. The Indigenous population is marginalized here in Canada for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The most marginalized are Indigenous women. So we've just gone through a national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which have identified more than 1,300 cases of women either being killed because they're Indigenous women being killed or Indigenous women disappearing. So we've just gone through, I think the inquiry traveled around Canada for probably a year or more. And most of my students had never heard of that. Now, so they spent an hour and a half watching this film, and in their responses, many of them were like, I had no idea this was going on. Mm-hmm. So I guess the first step, like we talk about reconciliation as the end point, it's probably more of a relationship than a destination, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But the first thing is we got to get to the truth. We got to learn about this stuff. Then we got to get to the justice of like, how do we make them, not necessarily make amends. I don't want that to sound too Christian, but like, how do we get to justice? Mm-hmm. Right. So we've got a lot of work to do before we can get to that, pie in the sky, but it's somewhere up in the mountains, that the goal of reconciliation. And you folks are probably dealing with that as well, right? Like you're with the end of apartheid, that's a huge step, but it's the social change that's going to come as a generational thing.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing that now, right? With young millennials, who I employ a lot of them. So it's quite interesting, coming with my generation. I sound old, but I'm only like 40. But yeah, just to see, how society has moved on, but yet still holds on to many things. You know what I mean?
For sure.
And as you say, dude, it's going to take like another 100 years, 50 years to really try to move on.
Yeah, and I guess what we can do as parents, as teachers, as podcasters is just get the word out. Because what I found in my experience, I've given a lot of talks. My book was published in 2013, and I've literally given hundreds of talks. And when it's a mixed crowd, the brown faces kind of nod, like, yeah, we know this is our family story. But the white faces are shocked because they, like say an adult crowd, they have never heard of this stuff, and it really challenges. It's almost like an intervention. You know that expression, like you intervene with an alcoholic or whatever.
Yeah.
They are truly shocked.
Yeah. Because
it flies in the face of really everything they've been taught and how they see themselves.
That's fascinating. Mate, let's wrap this up. Why do you do what you do? Why do you do all of this? What gets you out of bed in the morning?
Well, at one level, I'm the parent of three daughters, and I don't want to have to explain to them, to explain away some injustice that's going on in society, somebody being shaken down by the cops, being ID'd or something like that. And really, it's just, there are social relations, economic situations that just aren't right. Like they're unjust. And I guess it's just trying to identify, I've got the privilege to be able to spend years researching these things. And so I'm hopefully using that privilege to make Canada a better place.
And the world by extension.
Yeah.
James Daschuk, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, for sure, Matt. Take care of yourself.
All right, mate. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Matt Brown Show, guys. Don't forget, you can catch me on all social media platforms for the latest updates, news, and a show history. So if you've been catching this on the podcast, please head on over to our YouTube channel and pound that subscribe button. It would be great to catch the video version there. And if you want a free copy of my #1 Amazon best-selling book, You're in a Game, for free right now today, you can grab that on mattbrownshow.com/ebook.